It was the biggest scandal in the universe, or it was a marvel of infinite love, which I refer to the naked, bleeding man, battered from smacks and bruises, who was crucified 2,000 years ago. Scandal or a marvel of infinite love? There are several good keys to the problem. When I was at Avondale College in the 1940s, the news came of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They belonged to an encampment of Essenes about 200 years before Christ. But the documents were much older, and there were thousands of fragments. But among the discoveries was one very ancient scroll that had the equivalent of 66 chapters. It was the scroll of Isaiah, and it was exactly the same in its wording as in all Bibles of the 20th or 21st century. Something very similar before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. An Egyptian king ordered that a translation be made of the Old Testament. This began about 300 years before Jesus Christ was born. The Septuagint was the Bible used in the first century by Jews and by Hebrews. But it too had the book of Isaiah, which in our Bibles is in 66 chapters. Now there's one part of that book which has brought thousands of atheists to God. And I want to remind you about it, because if you are intelligent, or if you are Christian, or if you are an atheist, you need to know about this passage, which belongs to hundreds of years before Bethlehem, before the coming of Christ. So I'm going to read it to you. Please listen very carefully. Your eternal destiny could hang on it. I will begin toward the end of the 52nd chapter, and then I'll read into the 53rd. This is the most wonderful thing in literature from all the millennia of human existence. We need to know about it. So here it is. See, my servant will act wisely. He'll be raised and lifted up and highly exalted. Just as there were many who were appalled at him. His appearance was so disfigured, beyond that of any man, and his form marred, beyond human likeness. So will he sprinkle many nations. Now my own comment, what man who ever lived could sprinkle many nations? I continue. Kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, What they've not heard, they will understand. And yet, I move into the 53rd chapter. Who has believed our message? To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender plant and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. For he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering, like one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows, yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And who can speak of his descendants? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was stricken. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he'd done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord made his life a guilt offering, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After the suffering of his soul, he'll see the light of life and be satisfied. By knowledge of him, my righteous servant will cause many to be accounted righteous. And he will bear their iniquities. Therefore I'll give him a portion among the great, and he'll divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of the many, and made intercession for the transgressors. There have been about 10 billion people born into this world. That description only fits one out of the 10 billion. You noticed that he was so wounded, so disfigured, so abused physically. His likeness did not appeal when he came to judgment. You noticed he was born like a plant out of dry ground. You notice that though he was cut off, yet he would prolong his days. You notice that though he'd have no descendants, he would see many spiritual children. 12 times this passage says God would make him an atonement for sin. It only fits one man, and it was written centuries before he was born. It's about the atonement of Jesus Christ. You know, God cannot die, but he did die derivatively. He was just as much God as though not at all man. He was just as much man as though not at all God. He had no fear of physical pain, but he did suffer agony because he anticipated that the weight of the sins of the world upon him might separate him from heaven, his heavenly Father, and the angels. So I suggest to you that our question, was this the greatest scandal of the universe or a marvel of infinite love, is answered in this passage. But there are other keys. There is the key of Gethsemane, to which I have alluded. Let me read to you from Matthew. I want you to notice the description of Gethsemane that's found in Matthew's Gospel. Here it is, before and during it. Then Jesus told them, "This very night you'll all fall away on account of me. For it's written, I'll strike the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered. But after I have risen, I'll go ahead of you to Galilee." Peter replied, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." "I tell you the truth," Jesus answered, "this very night, before the rooster crows, you'll disown me 3 times. But Peter declared, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all the other disciples said the same. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, John and James, along with him. He went a little further, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled, and he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." As though something appeared before him, which according to the Greek original was like a shock that makes a man's hair stand on end, that rends his nerves, freezes the blood in his veins. No wonder he is deranged, and he says he's sorrowful unto death. Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Could you men not keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter. "Watch and pray, so you'll not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the body is weak." He went away a second time and prayed, the same prayer. And when he came back, again he found them sleeping. Their eyes were heavy. So he left them, went away once more, prayed the third time, saying the same thing. Then he returned to the disciples and said to them, "Are you all sleeping? Look, the hour is near. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hand of sinners. Arise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." Now I want to remind you of something that happened 1,000 years before. King David had a beautiful son outwardly, a filthy, rotten son inwardly. He was like a Lucifer for those times. And he wanted his father's throne. So he got his father's best friend by name Ahithophel. He said, "I want your help to get my father's throne." And so there was a word spread around among all those who were disaffected. We're going to move the King David, off his throne. Now King David loved his people. He even loved his lovely looking but filthy hearted son. He said to his best friends, "I don't want death here. I don't want bloodshed. Let us flee." And so they went down the east side of Jerusalem, down a path and crossed the brook Kedron, the same brook and the same path that Jesus and his followers would travel 1,000 years later. And King David, with a small company of intimate friends, weeping, crossed into Gethsemane. And then as he mounted the Mount of Olives, he prayed that God's will might be done, and he surrendered himself to God. A little later, he crossed the river Jericho, which is a symbol of death. Jordan, not Jericho, Jordan. But ultimately, his rebel son was caught in a tree in the forest by his beautiful head of hair. And Joab the general stabbed him to death, and the rebellion was over. And King David crossed the Jordan River back and came back to his throne. It is a marvellous type of what would befall Jesus, the descendant of David. New Testament calls him the son of David, which means a descendant, who also came down that path, also with a small band, also with a heavy heart, also crossed Kedron, which means black waters, symbol of the black shadow that would envelop him as soon as he knelt in Gethsemane. My friends, we've looked at two keys to what is either the greatest scandal in the universe or a marvel of infinite love. Which one do you choose today?